Sarah Montgomery, the once respected sheriff of Valley Ridge, had everything: ambition, trust, and a bright future. Until Jackson Carter, a felon with a past, walked into her life. But when betrayal struck and Jackson left her for her own stepsister, Sarah's world shattered. In a tragic twist of fate, Sarah's overwhelming pain and anger drove her to a shocking, irreversible choice. Now, as the town's respected law enforcer turns into its most infamous criminal, secrets unravel, and the devastating consequences of one impulsive act will haunt them all forever. In the quiet town of Valley Ridge, Sheriff Sarah Mitchell was a respected figure. At 28 years old, she had already climbed the ranks of local law enforcement, earning the trust of the community and the admiration of her colleagues. Her reputation was built on a commitment to justice and a no-nonsense approach to her duties. She was strong-willed, independent, and had always made her career her #1 priority. Her personal life, however, was a different story. Sarah had never been one to let anyone get too close, preferring the security of her job to the uncertainty of relationships. She had no interest in romance, and her dedication to the badge left little room for distractions. But that all changed when she met Jackson Turner. Jackson had just been released from prison after serving time for assault and robbery. He was a man with a dark past, his criminal record enough to make most people steer clear of him. But there was something about Jackson that intrigued Sarah. He wasn't the type she usually gravitated toward, yet there was an undeniable magnetism about him. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, cool, confident, but with a hint of vulnerability beneath the tough exterior. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite his criminal history, he seemed to genuinely want to turn his life around. At first, Sarah kept her distance. She wasn't interested in getting involved with someone who could jeopardize her career, but fate had a way of pushing them together. They began talking, initially just casual conversations, but before long, Sarah found herself drawn into Jackson's world. He was charming, with a raw honesty that made her feel like she was the only person who truly understood him. He was different from the men she'd known. No pretense, no games. Jackson seemed to see her for who she really was, not just as the sheriff of Valley Ridge, but as a woman with her own struggles, her own insecurities. Their meetings became more frequent, and soon their connection deepened into something more. Sarah tried to keep the relationship hidden, knowing it would raise questions if anyone found out. She wasn't sure she could explain it to anyone. How she, of all people, had fallen for a man with such a dark past. But the more time she spent with Jackson, the harder it became to deny what was growing between them. As the months passed, Sarah's professional life began to show signs of strain. She started taking fewer shifts and spending more time with Jackson. She justified it to herself by telling herself that she deserved a break, that her career wasn't the only thing that defined her. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was beginning to put her faith in Jackson, to see him not as a criminal, but as someone who could offer her the companionship she had long been missing. It wasn't long before Sarah realized she was pregnant. The news hit her like a ton of bricks, and she struggled to come to terms with what it meant for her future. This was not part of the plan. She had always envisioned herself as the strong, independent woman who could handle anything except this. Now, with a baby on the way and a man who could barely take care of himself, Sarah was faced with the hardest decision of her life. Jackson, for his part, seemed to be genuinely happy about the pregnancy, though his reaction was mixed with uncertainty. He was no stranger to the mistakes of his past, and he wasn't sure he was ready for the responsibility of fatherhood. Yet there was something in his eyes when he looked at her, a quiet promise that he would try. It wasn't enough to make Sarah feel secure, but it was a start. As the days passed, Sarah wrestled with the pressure of her pregnancy, her job, and her feelings for Jackson. The lines between right and wrong began to blur. The sheriff, who had once made clear, rational decisions, was now navigating a tangled web of emotions, unsure of where she was headed, but knowing that the path she was on was leading her somewhere dangerous. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, the cracks in her relationship with Jackson started to show. What had once been a passionate connection seemed to fade with each passing day. At first, it had felt like they were building something real, an unexpected love story between a sheriff and a former felon, defying all the odds. But now Sarah could sense a growing distance between them. Jackson, who had once been so attentive, now seemed distracted and cold. His messages became fewer, and when they did speak, his words lacked the warmth they had once shared. The man she had once trusted so completely was becoming someone she barely recognized. Despite her growing concerns, Sarah couldn't bring herself to confront him. She kept telling herself that he was just dealing with the stress of his past, catching up with him, or maybe the thought of becoming a father was too overwhelming for him. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the emotional distance. Jackson's actions were starting to suggest he was hiding something more significant. He started spending more time away from her, often disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. When he did come around, he was often distant, lost in his own thoughts, avoiding her gaze. One evening, Sarah received a phone call from a friend who worked at the local diner. The news was jarring. Jackson had been seen with another woman, her own stepsister, Emily. The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She tried to brush it off at first, telling herself it could be a coincidence, that maybe Emily and Jackson were just talking, or perhaps he had just run into her by chance. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. The late nights, the sudden coldness, and now this. Jackson was seeing Emily, and worse, he hadn't even had the decency to tell her. The betrayal wasn't just the act itself. It was the fact that it had been happening right under her nose. Emily, who had always been a part of Sarah's life, was someone she trusted, someone she thought she could rely on. The thought that Emily could get involved with Jackson, the very man Sarah had risked everything for, was almost too much to bear. And what made it worse was that Emily had always known how Sarah felt about Jackson. She had seen the struggle, the sacrifices Sarah had made, and yet she had chosen to betray her in the most hurtful way possible. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling of being utterly humiliated. She felt like a fool, someone who had allowed herself to be vulnerable, only to have her trust shattered by the two people she had let into her life. Jackson's words began to replay in her mind, promises that he would change, that he would be there for her and the baby. But now those words seemed hollow, empty. His actions spoke louder than anything he had ever said. As the days dragged on, Sarah found herself consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, hurt, and confusion gnawed at her constantly. She couldn't stop thinking about Jackson and Emily, about how easily they had both discarded her. She tried to focus on the baby, to keep herself grounded, but every time she saw Jackson's face in her mind, the rage would rise again. She was being abandoned, not just by him, but by the life she had known. The law enforcement officer who had once prided herself on making clear, rational decisions, now felt like a woman lost in a sea of pain and bitterness. The thoughts of revenge began to creep into her mind, thoughts she never imagined she'd have. She knew she couldn't let Jackson get away with this, but she also knew that confronting him might only make things worse. Yet in her heart, a fire had been lit, a desire to make him understand what he had done to her. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had to act to regain some control over her shattered life. But how far was she willing to go to make Jackson feel the same hurt she was feeling? As the days passed, she became more convinced that she needed to do something drastic, something that would change everything. The tension between Sarah and Jackson reached a breaking point one cold evening in late fall. Sarah had been trying to keep her emotions in check, but the weight of the betrayal was too much to ignore any longer. She had seen Jackson with Emily, twice now, and each time it felt like a fresh wound. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface now bubbled to the top, filling every corner of her mind. She couldn't shake the image of the two of them together, laughing, whispering, as if she had never existed in their lives. Jackson's indifference only fueled her rage. He still hadn't made any effort to explain himself, and the distance between them seemed to grow by the day. Sarah's mind raced, torn between wanting answers and feeling an overwhelming need to make him pay for what he had done. The frustration was eating away at her, each day making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. She knew she couldn't keep going on like this, unable to confront him, unable to move on. The only solution that seemed to make sense in that moment was to confront him directly, face to face, to demand the answers she so desperately needed. That evening, Jackson came to her house, his face tired and distant, as if he already knew. This meeting was inevitable. He stepped inside without a word, and Sarah could feel the electricity in the air. She was done pretending everything was fine, done hiding behind the facade of control. This time, she wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. The conversation started civilly enough. Sarah asked him about his day, and Jackson replied with vague, uninterested answers. It was clear he had no intention of engaging in any meaningful discussion. She didn't waste any more time with pleasantries. Her voice trembled, but the words were clear. "What is going on with you and Emily?" Jackson stiffened. His eyes flickered, but he said nothing at first. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest, the anger surging through her like wildfire. She had known something was off, but hearing him finally acknowledge it was like a slap in the face. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and then finally spoke, but his words did little to ease the ache in Sarah's chest. "It's not what you think, Sarah. You're just overreacting. Overreacting." Sarah's blood boiled. She wanted to scream, to tell him how much he had hurt her, how much he had destroyed the fragile trust they had built. But instead, she stood there, her breath coming in short gasps, the words lodged in her throat. Jackson continued to explain, but Sarah couldn't hear him anymore. Her mind was racing, overwhelmed by the bitter realization that he had never been serious about her. All the promises, all the whispered sweet nothings, had been lies. The more Jackson tried to explain, the more Sarah felt the walls close in on her. The pain was unbearable, and it clouded her judgment. In that moment, the desire for revenge overtook everything else. Jackson had humiliated her, abandoned her, and worse, he had turned to her own sister, someone she had trusted. All of her fears, all of her doubts were confirmed. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to be the man he had promised her he could be. As Jackson moved toward the door, trying to leave, something inside Sarah snapped. She couldn't let him go. She couldn't let him walk away from her life, from their future, like he had done so easily with Emily. She was pregnant with his child, and he had just discarded her as if she were nothing. She couldn't allow him to do that to her. Without thinking, Sarah reached for the gun she kept hidden in the desk drawer. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, the weight of it grounding her in that single moment. Jackson didn't even seem to notice. He was almost out the door when she turned, and in an instant, the weapon was in her hands. The shock on his face was immediate, but before he could react, she pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the house, deafening in its finality. Jackson crumpled to the floor, his body lifeless. The room fell silent, and Sarah stood there, shaking, unable to comprehend what she had just done. What had started as an emotional confrontation had turned into something far more tragic. The man who had once meant so much to her, who had turned her world upside down, was now gone, and it was because of her. The gravity of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. There was no going back now. What she had done could never be undone. Sarah was no longer just a sheriff. She was a woman who had crossed a line, a woman whose choices would forever haunt her. And in that moment, as she stood over Jackson's body, she knew that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. In the days following Jackson's death, Sarah found herself spiraling deeper into a world of guilt, fear, and denial. At first, she couldn't fully comprehend what had happened, as if the events that led to the shooting hadn't truly occurred. But as the shock began to wear off, the reality of her actions settled in. The weight of what she had done was suffocating, and she knew there was no escaping it. Jackson was dead because of her anger, her hurt, and her need for revenge. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened was somehow justified. He had betrayed her in the worst way, and she had acted out of pure emotion, driven to a breaking point she couldn't control. But the truth of it, the cold, hard truth, was that she had taken a life, and that would change everything. Sarah knew she couldn't just leave Jackson's body there. The law was always watching, and as much as she had once been the enforcer of justice, now she was its criminal. In a frantic haze, she began to clean up the scene, wiping away any trace of evidence, moving his body and trying to make it appear as if something else had happened. She staged the scene carefully, trying to make it look like Jackson had been involved in some sort of violent struggle, a robbery gone wrong perhaps. But deep down, she knew it was futile. No matter how well she tried to cover it up, she couldn't erase the fact that the bullet that killed Jackson had come from her gun. Her mind raced as she tried to come up with an explanation, a story that would shield her from the inevitable questions that would come. She considered calling in a fake break-in, something that could distract the investigators, perhaps even make them believe the incident had been an accident. But the more she thought about it, the more the idea felt hollow. The truth was already catching up to her. The townspeople had known her for years, respected her, and now she had betrayed that trust in the most unforgivable way. She had always been the one who maintained control, who held the community's respect. But now, her very identity was crumbling. For days, Sarah kept herself busy, keeping her emotions buried under a layer of cold detachment. She maintained her usual routines, avoiding anyone who might look too closely at her, not daring to let anyone see the inner chaos that was taking over her mind. But the whispers had already started. People in the town had begun to notice the change in her, the way she was acting strangely, almost erratically. She wasn't sleeping well, barely eating. Her colleagues had begun to notice the strain, and Sarah was becoming more and more paranoid, convinced that someone would discover what she had done. The investigation into Jackson's death was slow at first, but it didn't take long for the pieces to start falling into place. The small town of Valley Ridge wasn't used to murders, let alone one involving their own sheriff. Soon, rumors began to surface, and questions started to be asked.
Sarah's alibi was weak and she couldn't account for certain details.
The investigation was starting to take a dangerous turn, and she knew it was only a matter of time before someone would make the connection. As a law enforcement officer, she had always been the one to find the truth. But now, she was the one running from it. Her internal struggle became more intense. Part of her wanted to come clean, to confess everything and face the consequences of her actions. But the other part, the part that was terrified of losing everything, held her back. She had worked her entire life to build a career, to gain the respect of the community, and the idea of losing it all was more than she could bear. She began to rationalize her decision further, telling herself that she had been pushed to the edge, that Jackson's betrayal had driven her to a place of no return. But deep down, she knew that justification was a lie. What she had done was wrong, and she could never undo it. As the investigation picked up momentum, Sarah's facade began to crack. The guilt gnawed at her, and she could no longer ignore the feelings of dread that crept into her every thought. Every knock on the door, every phone call made her jump. The walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the truth surfaced. The sheriff, who had once been a pillar of the town's justice system, was now on the other side of the law, running from the consequences of her own crime. The irony of it wasn't lost on her. She had chosen Jackson over her career, over the trust of the people who had once depended on her. And now she was left to face the mess she had made, knowing that there would be no escape from the truth. As the investigation into Jackson's death deepened, Sarah found herself trapped in a tightening web of lies and guilt. The pressure was unbearable, and every day felt like a countdown to her inevitable exposure. She was no longer the confident sheriff who had once commanded respect. Now she was a woman running from her own conscience, from the inevitable reckoning she could feel closing in. The whispers around town were becoming harder to ignore. People were starting to question her behavior, the changes in her demeanor, the way she had suddenly become erratic. Her colleagues in law enforcement were suspicious, and Sarah knew they had started connecting the dots. Despite the mounting suspicion, Sarah stubbornly clung to the hope that she could somehow slip through the cracks. She convinced herself that if she kept a low profile and stayed focused on her duties, the investigation would eventually fizzle out. But as the days passed, she could feel the walls closing in. Her steps grew heavier, her face pale and drawn. She stopped attending social events and began isolating herself more and more, not just from her friends and colleagues, but from herself as well. The reality of what she had done, the murder, the betrayal, the destruction of her life, was too much to face. One night, after a particularly long shift, Sarah went home and poured herself a glass of wine, trying to numb the constant ache inside her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jackson's face, his lifeless body on the floor. She tried to tell herself it had been an accident, that she had been driven by anger and hurt. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. She had taken a life, taken it in a moment of blind rage, a moment that now felt like a permanent scar on her soul. The pressure of the investigation continued to mount, and Sarah became more desperate to cover her tracks. She began erasing any traces of her involvement, even going so far as to delete texts and erase records of her whereabouts on the night Jackson died. But the more she tried to cover up her actions, the more she felt like she was digging herself into a deeper hole. The lies were piling up, and she was sinking in them. It wasn't long before the town's suspicions turned into open accusations. A few residents had started to piece together the timeline, noting the suspicious circumstances surrounding Jackson's death. It didn't help that Sarah's behavior had been so erratic, her constant need to avoid questions only raising more eyebrows. The evidence was mounting, and Sarah knew she was no longer in control. She could feel the noose tightening, but she was paralyzed, unable to make the right decision. Every choice she made seemed to lead her further down the dark path she had set herself on. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, Sarah's lieutenant, someone she had worked with for years and trusted like a brother, showed up at her office. His face was grave, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her stomach drop. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said softly. The weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. She knew what was coming. The investigation had reached a climax. He had found something that connected her to Jackson's death. Her heart raced as she watched him stand there, waiting for her to respond. The guilt, the shame, all of it rushed back to her in a wave of overwhelming emotion. She tried to keep her composure, but her hands trembled as she sat across from him. She knew she couldn't keep up the charade any longer. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. "Sarah," he continued, his voice laced with concern, "we have evidence that points to you." His words were like a knife to the heart, and Sarah felt the world spinning around her. She wanted to scream, to deny it all, but there was no point. The reality was clear. She had killed Jackson, and now the consequences were catching up with her. The next few hours felt like an eternity as Sarah was questioned by the department's internal affairs team. Every answer she gave seemed to dig her deeper into a hole she couldn't escape. The truth was undeniable. Her role in Jackson's death had been revealed, and there was no way to undo it. By the time the evening came, Sarah had been arrested and charged with murder. The same sheriff who had once stood at the forefront of justice was now behind bars, a broken woman who had lost everything. The town that had once looked up to her was now left in shock, struggling to comprehend how the woman they trusted could have committed such a heinous act. As Sarah was led out of the police station, she couldn't help but think about everything she had sacrificed. Her career, her integrity, and the trust of the people who had relied on her. It was all gone, destroyed by her own hand. The only thing left now was the long road ahead, one filled with nothing but regret and the harsh reality of what she had become.